I thought my landlord was just being helpful when he showed up to fix things I never reported broken, but when I discovered the hidden cameras throughout my apartment, I realized he'd been watching my every move for months, and what I found on his computer was far worse than I ever imagined. Moving into my first apartment at 22 felt like the ultimate symbol of independence. After living with roommates through college, I was finally ready for my own space where I could come and go as I pleased without anyone judging my habits or lifestyle. The apartment was perfect for my budget, a cozy one-bedroom unit in an older building with character and charm. The rent was surprisingly affordable for the area, which should have been my first red flag, but I was too excited about having my own place to question why such a great apartment was so reasonably priced. My landlord, Robert, seemed like the ideal property manager during our initial meeting. He was friendly, professional, and eager to accommodate my needs. When I mentioned that I worked unusual hours as a freelance graphic designer, he assured me that noise wouldn't be an issue since the building was well insulated. "I take pride in maintaining a comfortable living environment for all my tenants," Robert told me as he handed over the keys. "If you ever need anything fixed or have any concerns, don't hesitate to call me. I'm very responsive to tenant needs." I appreciated his attentiveness and signed the lease immediately. The apartment came with everything I needed: updated appliances, reliable internet, and plenty of natural light for my home office setup. The first few weeks in my new place were blissful. I loved having my own space to decorate, cook whatever I wanted, and work on client projects without interruption. Robert seemed to respect my privacy, only contacting me once to confirm that everything was working properly. But then strange things started happening that I initially dismissed as coincidences. The first incident occurred about a month after I'd moved in. I came home from running errands to find that my bathroom faucet had been repaired. I hadn't reported any problems with it, but Robert had left a note explaining that he'd noticed a small leak during a routine inspection and had fixed it while I was out. "I hope you don't mind that I took care of this," his note read. "I have a master key for maintenance emergencies and wanted to prevent any water damage. The faucet should work perfectly now." I was confused because I hadn't noticed any leak, and I certainly hadn't given permission for him to enter my apartment while I was gone. But the faucet did work better than before, and I figured maybe he'd caught a problem before it became serious. A week later, I discovered that my kitchen cabinet door had been adjusted. It had been slightly crooked since I'd moved in, something I'd planned to mention eventually but wasn't urgent. Yet somehow Robert had noticed this minor issue and fixed it without me saying anything. How did he even know about these problems? I wondered aloud, but I convinced myself that he was just a very attentive landlord who noticed details during regular inspections. The pattern continued over the following weeks. My bedroom window screen was tightened, a loose floorboard in the living room was secured, and the bathroom exhaust fan was cleaned and adjusted. All of these fixes were for issues I'd either never noticed or hadn't bothered to report yet. Robert always left polite notes explaining what he'd repaired and why it was necessary. He never asked for additional rent or fees for these improvements, which made his behavior seem generous rather than intrusive. "You have such a wonderful landlord," my friend Sarah commented when I mentioned all the proactive repairs. "Most landlords ignore problems until you complain multiple times. This guy actually cares about maintaining the property." But something about the situation bothered me. How was Robert noticing these minor issues? When was he conducting these inspections? I was home most days working, and he'd never knocked or announced himself during any inspection visits. I started paying closer attention to signs that someone had been in my apartment while I was out. I began leaving small objects in specific positions and checking whether they'd been moved when I returned home. Sure enough, I found evidence that someone was entering my apartment regularly. A pen I'd left perpendicular to my desk edge would be parallel. A book I'd placed face down would be face up. My bathroom towel would be hanging differently than I'd left it. Initially, I tried to rationalize these changes. Maybe I was misremembering how I'd left things. Maybe the building had cleaning staff I didn't know about. Maybe there were maintenance workers who needed access for building-wide repairs. But the evidence was becoming too consistent to ignore. Someone was definitely entering my apartment when I wasn't home, and based on the timing of the repairs, it had to be Robert. I decided to confront him directly about his unannounced visits to my apartment. "Robert, I appreciate all the maintenance work you've been doing," I said when I called him, "but I'd prefer if you could let me know in advance when you need to enter my apartment." "Of course," he replied smoothly. I always try to schedule maintenance during times when tenants aren't home to avoid disrupting their daily routines. But you're right. I should give you more advance notice. "How do you know when I'm not home?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "I usually just check to see if your car is in the parking lot. If it's not there, I assume you're out running errands." That explanation seemed reasonable, but something about his tone made me uncomfortable. He sounded like he'd prepared that answer in advance. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention to my surroundings and started noticing details that disturbed me. Robert seemed to know things about my daily routine that he shouldn't have known. "I noticed you've been working late nights recently," he mentioned casually when I ran into him in the lobby. "Make sure you're getting enough sleep." How did he know I was working late? My apartment faced the courtyard, not the street, so he couldn't see lights from my windows. And I hadn't mentioned my work schedule to him. Another time, he commented on groceries I'd bought. "I see you're eating healthier these days." That's great for someone your age. Again, how could he possibly know what I was eating unless he was somehow monitoring my grocery shopping or going through my refrigerator during his unauthorized visits? The comments were always framed as friendly concern, but they revealed knowledge about my personal life that felt invasive and inappropriate. I started varying my schedule and being more observant about my surroundings. That's when I noticed that Robert's car was often parked near the building during times when I would typically be home alone. One afternoon, I saw him sitting in his car in the parking lot, apparently talking on his phone. But when I looked more closely, I realized he was facing my apartment window and seemed to be watching my unit rather than having a phone conversation. When I waved at him, he quickly started his car and drove away without acknowledging me. That incident convinced me that Robert's behavior had crossed the line from attentive landlord to creepy surveillance. I decided to investigate more thoroughly what was happening in my apartment when I wasn't there. I bought a small security camera online and hid it in my living room, positioned to record anyone who entered my apartment. The camera was motion activated and would send alerts to my phone whenever it detected movement. The first day I used the camera, I got an alert at 2:30 p.m. while I was at a coffee shop working on a client project. Someone was in my apartment. I immediately checked the live feed and saw Robert walking through my living room, examining my belongings and taking photos of my personal items with his phone. My hands shook as I watched him pick up mail from my kitchen counter, read through it, and photograph several documents. He opened my laptop and spent several minutes browsing through what appeared to be my personal files. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He walked into my bedroom and started going through my dresser drawers, photographing clothing and personal items. This wasn't maintenance or inspection. This was a clear violation of my privacy and potentially criminal behavior. I wanted to confront him immediately, but I realized I needed more evidence before taking action. If Robert was willing to go through my personal belongings, who knew what else he might be capable of? I left the hidden camera in place and continued monitoring his unauthorized visits to my apartment. Over the course of a week, I documented 3 separate incidents where Robert entered my unit without permission and spent extended time examining my personal property. The footage was disturbing. Robert would photograph my mail, browse through my computer files, examine my clothing, and even go through my bathroom cabinet. He seemed particularly interested in my work schedule and personal routine, but the most shocking discovery came when I noticed something glinting in the corner of my bedroom ceiling during one of his visits. Robert climbed onto a chair and adjusted what appeared to be a small camera hidden among the light fixture. My apartment was already equipped with surveillance cameras, and Robert had been watching me constantly, and I felt physically sick realizing that Robert had been recording my most private moments, sleeping, changing clothes, relaxing in my own home. The violation was so profound that I could barely process what was happening. I immediately called the police. I need to report that my landlord has been illegally entering my apartment and has installed hidden cameras, I told the dispatcher. Are you in immediate danger? I don't think so, but I have video evidence of him entering my apartment without permission and adjusting hidden surveillance equipment. Detective Maria Santos was assigned to my case. She took my complaint seriously and arranged to meet me that evening to review the evidence I'd collected. This is clearly illegal surveillance and possibly stalking behavior, Detective Santos said after reviewing my camera footage. We need to document everything and obtain a search warrant for your apartment to locate and remove any hidden cameras. The search of my apartment the next day was eye-opening and horrifying. Police found hidden cameras in every room: bedroom, bathroom, living room, and kitchen. The cameras were professionally installed and connected to a wireless network that allowed remote viewing. These cameras have been here for months, possibly since before you moved in, Detective Santos explained. This was a premeditated surveillance operation, not something your landlord installed recently. The realization that Robert had been watching me from the very first day I moved in was devastating. Every private moment in my apartment had been recorded and potentially saved for his personal viewing. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. When police searched Robert's property with a warrant, they found extensive surveillance equipment and recordings not just of me, but of multiple tenants across several properties he managed. Your landlord has been running surveillance operations on dozens of tenants, Detective Santos told me during a follow-up meeting. We found terabytes of recorded footage spanning several years. Robert had been systematically spying on tenants, particularly young women living alone. He had detailed files on each tenant's daily routines, work schedules, personal relationships, and private activities. This appears to be a long-term criminal enterprise, the prosecutor explained during our first meeting. Your landlord has been using his position to gain access to rental properties for the purpose of illegal surveillance and voyeurism. And the evidence against Robert was overwhelming. In addition to the cameras found in my apartment, police discovered surveillance footage of over 30 different tenants, detailed files containing personal information about tenants' lives, equipment for remote monitoring of multiple properties, photos of tenants' personal documents and belongings, recordings of private conversations and activities. The investigation expanded rapidly as police contacted other tenants in Robert's properties. Many had no idea they'd been under surveillance, while others came forward with stories of suspicious behavior they'd dismissed at the time. I always wondered how he knew so much about my personal life, said Jennifer, a tenant who'd lived in one of Robert's buildings for 2 years. He'd make comments about my work schedule, my boyfriend, even what TV shows I watched. I thought he was just being friendly. Another tenant, Michelle, recalled feeling uncomfortable about Robert's frequent, unannounced visits to her apartment. He was always finding things to fix that I hadn't complained about, she explained. My friend said I was lucky to have such an attentive landlord, but something about it felt wrong. The pattern was consistent across multiple properties. Robert would target young women living alone, particularly those who were new to the area and didn't have strong social support networks. He'd use his position as landlord to gain access to their apartments and install surveillance equipment. He had a type, Detective Santos explained: young professional women who were living independently for the first time. He seemed to target tenants who were unlikely to have family or friends checking on them regularly. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation was disturbing. Robert had been operating this surveillance network for at least 5 years, becoming increasingly sophisticated in his methods and technology. He started with basic hidden cameras, FBI agent Davis explained during a briefing about the case. But over time, he upgraded to more advanced equipment that could stream video directly to his computer and mobile devices. Robert's home office was equipped with multiple monitors displaying live feeds from various apartments. He could watch dozens of tenants simultaneously and switch between different camera angles within each unit. This wasn't casual voyeurism, Agent Davis continued. This was a systematic operation designed to monitor and document every aspect of his tenants' private lives. The extent of Robert's surveillance was staggering. He'd recorded thousands of hours of footage showing tenants in their most private moments: sleeping, bathing, changing clothes, having intimate conversations, and engaging in personal activities they believed were completely private. He kept detailed logs of each tenant's activities, Detective Santos revealed. He knew their work schedules, social routines, personal relationships, and even intimate details about their private lives. But the investigation uncovered something even more sinister. Robert hadn't just been watching his tenants. He'd been using the information he gathered to manipulate and control their lives in subtle ways. He would time his apartment visits to coincide with specific activities he'd observed through the cameras, Agent Davis explained. If he knew a tenant was having relationship problems, he'd show up with flowers or offer emotional support. If someone was struggling financially, he'd offer to reduce rent or provide other assistance. This manipulation served multiple purposes. It made Robert appear caring and helpful to his tenants, reducing the likelihood they'd report suspicious behavior. It also created emotional dependency that made tenants less likely to move out or complain about his management style. He was essentially grooming his tenants, the FBI's behavioral analyst explained. He used the intimate knowledge gained through surveillance to present himself as the perfect landlord and emotional support system. Several tenants reported that Robert had seemed almost psychic in his ability to anticipate their needs and provide support during difficult times. When I was going through a breakup, he showed up at my door with ice cream and offered to listen if I needed to talk, recalled Lisa, a former tenant. At the time, I thought it was incredibly thoughtful. Now I realize he'd been watching me cry through hidden cameras. Another tenant, Amanda, remembered Robert's uncanny ability to know when she was feeling lonely or stressed. He'd invite me to dinner or suggest we watch a movie together whenever I seemed down, she said. I thought he was just being nice, but now I understand he was using my emotional state to manipulate me. The manipulation had worked effectively for years. None of Robert's tenants had suspected they were being surveilled, and many considered him an exceptionally caring and attentive landlord. He created a false sense of security and trust, Detective Santos explained. His tenants felt safe and cared for, which made them less likely to question his behavior or investigate suspicious incidents. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details emerged about Robert's activities. He'd been sharing surveillance footage with other people through online networks dedicated to voyeurism and exploitation. We found evidence that he was part of a larger community of individuals who traded surveillance footage and shared techniques for spying on unsuspecting victims, Agent Davis revealed. Robert's computer contained communications with dozens of other voyeurs who operated similar surveillance networks in different cities. They shared technical advice, discussed target selection strategies, and traded recordings of their victims. This was a coordinated criminal network, the prosecutor explained. Robert wasn't acting alone. He was part of a community that encouraged and facilitated this type of exploitation. The network had been operating for years, with members supporting each other's criminal activities and helping to avoid detection by law enforcement. They shared information about avoiding detection, upgrading surveillance technology, and identifying vulnerable targets, Agent Davis continued. This was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with national reach. The discovery of this network led to arrests in multiple states as law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts to identify and prosecute other members of the voyeurism community. Your case helped us uncover a much larger criminal operation, Detective Santos told me. Dozens of other victims have been identified, and several major operators have been arrested. But for me personally, learning about the scope of Robert's activities and his connections to other predators was overwhelming. The violation I'd experienced wasn't isolated. It was part of a systematic pattern of exploitation that had affected dozens of of women. The psychological impact can be severe, explained Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a therapist who specialized in treating surveillance victims. Learning that your most private moments were recorded, shared, and used for manipulation can cause lasting trauma. I struggled with severe anxiety and depression following the discovery of Robert's surveillance operation. Simple activities like sleeping, changing clothes, or relaxing in my own home became sources of stress and paranoia. I kept looking for hidden cameras everywhere, I explained during one of my therapy sessions. I couldn't feel safe or private anywhere, even after moving to a new apartment. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that my reactions were normal responses to a profound violation of privacy and trust. Surveillance victims often experience symptoms similar to those seen in sexual assault survivors, she explained. The sense of violation, loss of control, and betrayal of trust can be deeply traumatic. The therapy process was long and difficult. I had to work through feelings of shame, self-blame, and paranoia while gradually rebuilding my sense of safety and privacy. It's important to remember that you did nothing wrong, Dr. Rodriguez reminded me repeatedly. You were targeted by a predator who exploited his position of trust to harm you. But understanding that intellectually didn't make the emotional healing any easier. I struggled with intrusive thoughts about Robert watching my most private moments and sharing those recordings with others. The legal proceedings added another layer of stress to my recovery process. I had to testify about the intimate details of how Robert had violated my privacy, describing in court how I discovered the surveillance equipment and the impact it had on my life. The defendant systematically violated the privacy and trust of vulnerable tenants, the prosecutor argued during opening statements. He used his position as a landlord to gain access to their homes for the purpose of illegal surveillance and voyeuristic exploitation. Robert's defense team tried to minimize his behavior by arguing that landlords have legitimate reasons to monitor their properties and that his surveillance activities were motivated by security concerns rather than voyeuristic gratification. My client was attempting to protect his properties and ensure tenant safety, his attorney claimed. While his methods may have been inappropriate, his intentions were not criminal. But the evidence overwhelmingly contradicted this defense. The recordings found on Robert's computer clearly showed him focusing on tenants' private activities rather than security concerns. He'd recorded women sleeping, bathing, changing clothes, and engaging in intimate activities. This wasn't security monitoring, the prosecutor responded. This was systematic voyeurism designed to exploit and manipulate vulnerable women. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which dozens of Robert's victims testified about their experiences. Many described the same pattern of behavior: unexpected repairs, invasive personal comments, and a gradual realization that their landlord knew too much about their private lives. He made me feel like he really cared about my well-being, testified Sarah, one of Robert's longest-term victims. But now I understand that his concern was fake, based on information he'd gathered by spying on me without my knowledge. Another victim, Rachel, described the psychological impact of learning she'd been under surveillance for over a year. I felt completely violated and betrayed, she said through tears. This person I trusted had been watching my most private moments and using that information to manipulate me. The technical evidence presented during the trial was extensive and damning. FBI experts testified about the sophistication of Robert's surveillance network and the methods he'd used to conceal cameras and recording equipment. The defendant had installed over 200 surveillance devices across multiple properties, Agent Davis testified. The system was designed to provide comprehensive coverage of tenants' activities while remaining completely hidden. The recordings found on Robert's computer were categorized and analyzed to demonstrate the scope of his voyeuristic activities. He'd organized footage by tenant, date, and type of activity, creating a searchable database of surveillance material. The defendant kept detailed records of his surveillance activities, Detective Santos testified. He had thousands of hours of recordings showing tenants in private situations, organized in a way that suggests ongoing systematic voyeurism. Robert's communications with other members of the voyeurism network were also presented as evidence of his criminal intent and the organized nature of his activities. The defendant regularly shared surveillance footage with other criminals and participated in discussions about techniques for exploiting tenants, Agent Davis explained. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Robert was convicted of multiple felonies including voyeurism, illegal surveillance, breaking and entering, stalking, and participating in a criminal enterprise. The evidence in this case is overwhelming, the judge said during sentencing. The defendant systematically violated the privacy and trust of vulnerable tenants over a period of years, causing lasting psychological harm to dozens of victims. Robert was sentenced to 12 years in prison and was required to pay substantial restitution to all identified victims. He was also permanently banned from working in property management and required to register as a sex offender. This sentence reflects the serious nature of the defendant's crimes and the lasting harm he caused to innocent victims, the prosecutor said following the sentencing hearing. But for me and the other victims, the legal resolution was only the beginning of our healing process. The psychological impact of Robert's surveillance operation would take years to fully address. Legal justice doesn't automatically lead to emotional healing, Dr. Rodriguez explained. The trauma of being surveilled and exploited can have lasting effects that require ongoing therapeutic work. I continued therapy for months after the trial, working to rebuild my sense of safety and privacy. I had to learn new coping strategies for managing anxiety and paranoia while gradually returning to normal daily activities. The goal isn't to forget what happened, Dr. Rodriguez explained. It's to process the trauma in a way that allows you to move forward with your life. Moving to a new apartment was particularly challenging. I was hypersensitive to any signs of surveillance or inappropriate landlord behavior, conducting extensive inspections for hidden cameras and documenting all interactions with property managers. It's normal to be hypervigilant after this type of violation, Dr. Rodriguez assured me. Your brain is trying to protect you from experiencing similar trauma in the future. I learned about tenant rights regarding privacy and surveillance, legal protections against voyeurism, and warning signs of predatory landlord behavior. The education was empowering, but also highlighted how vulnerable tenants can be to exploitation. Most people assume their homes are private spaces where they're safe from surveillance, I explained during a victim impact presentation. But landlords have legitimate access that can be abused by predators like Robert. The case attracted significant media attention and led to increased awareness about tenant privacy rights and landlord accountability. Several states strengthened laws regarding surveillance in rental properties and increased penalties for voyeurism crimes. This case demonstrates how predators can exploit positions of trust and authority, Detective Santos told reporters. Landlords have legitimate access to rental properties, but that access comes with legal and ethical responsibilities. Advocacy groups used Robert's case to push for stronger tenant protections and better oversight of property management companies. Tenants deserve to feel safe and secure in their homes, said Maria Gonzalez, director of a tenant rights organization. When landlords abuse their position to spy on tenants, they're committing serious crimes that can cause lasting psychological damage. The investigation also revealed gaps in background check procedures for property managers and highlighted the need for better oversight of rental property operations. There's currently very little regulation of the property management industry, explained housing attorney David Chen. Predators like Robert can operate for years without detection because there's no systematic monitoring of landlord behavior. Several of Robert's victims became advocates for stronger tenant protections and better enforcement of privacy laws. We worked with legislators to draft new regulations requiring disclosure of surveillance equipment and stricter penalties for voyeurism crimes. No one should have to experience what we went through, said Jennifer, one of Robert's longest-term victims. We want to make sure landlords can't exploit their position to spy on tenants. The advocacy work was both empowering and re-traumatizing. Speaking publicly about our experiences helped raise awareness, but also required repeatedly reliving the trauma of Robert's surveillance operation. It's important for people to understand that this type of crime is more common than they realize, I explained during a legislative hearing about tenant privacy rights. Predators often use positions of trust and authority to exploit vulnerable victims. Years later, I still struggle with the aftermath of Robert's surveillance operation. I've learned to live with increased awareness of privacy and security issues, but the experience fundamentally changed how I think about trust and safety. I'm more cautious now about sharing personal information with landlords or property managers, I explained during a recent interview about tenant rights. I ask more questions about privacy policies and document all interactions. The experience taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong and to investigate suspicious behavior rather than dismissing concerns as paranoia. If your landlord seems to know too much about your personal life or schedule, that's a red flag worth investigating, I advised other renters. Legitimate property managers maintain professional boundaries and respect tenant privacy. I also learned the importance of understanding my legal rights as a tenant and knowing how to report suspicious or inappropriate behavior by landlords or property managers. Many tenants don't realize they have strong legal protections against surveillance and invasion of privacy, I explained. But you can't exercise rights you don't know you have. The support group I joined with other surveillance victims became an important part of my healing process. Sharing experiences with people who understood the unique trauma of being secretly recorded helped reduce feelings of isolation and shame. There's something powerful about talking to other people who've been through similar experiences, reflected Lisa, another member of our support group. It helps you realize that the trauma is real and that your reactions are normal. Our group also worked together on advocacy efforts, using our collective experiences to push for stronger legal protections and better support services for surveillance victims. Individual voices can be dismissed as isolated incidents, explained Sarah, who became a leading advocate for surveillance victim rights. But when multiple victims speak together, it's harder to ignore the systematic nature of these crimes. The hidden cameras that Robert installed throughout my apartment taught me that predators can use any position of authority or trust to exploit victims. The helpful, professional landlord who seemed to care about my comfort and safety was actually a criminal who had been violating my privacy from day one. But the experience also demonstrated the importance of documenting suspicious behavior and trusting your instincts when something doesn't feel right. If I hadn't investigated Robert's unauthorized apartment visits, he might have continued his surveillance operation indefinitely. The landlord who was spying on me is now in prison where he belongs, but the scars from his violation of my privacy will probably last forever. They serve as a reminder that safety and privacy can't be taken for granted and that predators often hide behind facades of helpfulness and professionalism. Most importantly, the experience taught me that when something feels wrong, it's worth investigating even if you hope you're just being paranoid. Sometimes paranoia is actually justified, and trusting your instincts can protect you from serious harm and help prevent other people from becoming victims. The surveillance operation that Robert conducted was a systematic violation of privacy and trust that affected dozens of women over several years. But by speaking out about what happened and working to strengthen legal protections, victims like me can help ensure that fewer people experience similar violations in the future. The fight for tenant privacy rights and protection from surveillance continues, but cases like ours have raised awareness and led to meaningful changes in laws and regulations. While I'll never fully recover from the trauma of being secretly recorded in my own home, I'm grateful that our experiences can help protect other tenants from similar exploitation.